Pete was a seasoned trucker who had grown accustomed to lonely nights, endless highways, and oppressive silence over the years. This time, his route took him through the Nevada desert, a long, monotonous road where the only company was the faint music from the radio. As the day began to turn to evening, Pete, tired from hours of driving, was excited to see a road sign that suggested a shortcut. The new road was narrow and seemed completely empty. Not a single other car, no indication of human presence. A thick silence enveloped the space, only the monotonous hum of the truck's engine breaking the dead calm. Something about this stretch of road was unnerving, but Pete was too tired to give it much thought. The radio began to lose signal, interrupted by static. Pete tried to tune it in, but all the stations disappeared. There was nothing around but sand and rare dry bushes that flickered in the headlights. The sun was quickly disappearing over the horizon, and the shadows of the desert began to grow longer, turning into a dark curtain. Pete shrugged off the uncomfortable sensations and concentrated on the road. But the further he drove, the more a sense of anxiety grew inside him. It wasn't just the road. Something was not right here. Pete drove on, but the road seemed endless, as if it were dragging him deeper into the desert. The GPS, which had previously shown him the direction clearly, now just flashed a white screen with the words "no signal." He frowned but didn't stop. The phone in his pocket had also lost connection. This was not surprising in a deserted place, but at the same time, there was an elusive feeling that something was wrong. The sun had already disappeared behind the horizon, and the road was drowned in thick darkness. Only the truck's headlights illuminated the narrow stretch of asphalt ahead, but even they seemed less bright than usual. The silence was almost tangible. No wind noise, no insects singing, no distant bird song. Pete turned on the radio to fill the vacuum, but instead of music, he heard only faint static. He tried tuning the wave by slowly turning the knob, but no station responded. Sighing, he turned off the radio, trying to suppress his irritation. Everything seemed too empty, too wrong. A few minutes later, his truck's engine suddenly started to malfunction. A metallic grinding and loud clicking sound made Pete grip the steering wheel tighter. He slammed his palm against the dashboard as if that would help, but the engine wheezed loudly and died. The headlights went out, and the cab plunged into total darkness. "What the hell?" he muttered as he got out of the car. The darkness outside was even thicker. Pete turned on his flashlight, and a narrow beam of light tore out patches of road and sand from the darkness. He examined the hood, lifted it, and carefully checked the engine, but saw nothing unusual. Everything seemed to be in perfect working order. Something else caught his eye. There were some old cars by the side of the road, a little further down in the sand. Their bodies were half buried in the dunes, but some were still quite visible. Pete decided to get closer. Lighting the way with his flashlight, he approached the first car. It was an old sedan with the doors left open and the seats looking empty. Inside were faded magazines and empty bottles, all covered with a layer of sand, as if the car had been there for decades. Several other cars were located further away. They looked similar, all empty with their doors open. No sign of drivers or passengers. But it was under one of these cars that Pete noticed something that made him freeze: bare footprints. The tracks led from one of the cars to the road, and then suddenly broke off. Pete crouched down to get a better look at them and noticed that they looked fresh, as if they had been left just a few hours ago. He stood up, looking around, but saw nothing but endless darkness. His heart began to beat faster as it dawned on him. Someone had been here recently, but where was that person now? Returning to the truck, He sat down in the cab, trying to calm down. But before he could even exhale, the radio, which had been silent until then, suddenly came to life. It was transmitting faint static noise, but fragments of voices could be heard in the background. The voices were quiet, almost whispery, and their words were hard to make out. But Pete caught a few phrases. "You are not alone, and they will come." His fingers trembled as he turned off the radio. This time he couldn't shrug off the fear. He knew that what had started was not just imagination or chance. Something was here, right next to him, in the darkness. The darkness around him became almost tangible, as if it had weight. Pete sat in the cab of his truck, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his fingers turned white. The silence was back, but now it seemed even more oppressive. Even the wind, which had just been gently stirring the sand dunes, seemed to have died down, leaving only tense anticipation. Suddenly, Pete noticed movement in his side mirror. He turned on his flashlight and illuminated the road behind him. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure, tall and thin, standing in the darkness, looking directly at him. His face was impossible to see, but even from a distance he could feel its gaze literally burning him. He leaned back, hiding the flashlight. "Calm down, it's just fatigue," he convinced himself. But his heart was beating so fast that its beats echoed in his temples. Then something hit the back of the truck. The loud, hollow sound echoed. Pete jumped up in his seat, grabbed the ignition key, and tried to start the engine. There was no response. The truck remained dead, just like before. In desperation, he looked in the mirror again, but saw nothing. And yet, the feeling that someone or something was watching did not leave him. Armed with a flashlight, he got out of the cab, trying to see what could have hit the car. The light of the flashlight caught the empty road and sand dunes, but there were no tracks. No stone, no debris. And then he heard it, a soft, almost indecipherable whisper. It seemed to come from everywhere, from the sand, from the darkness, even from the air. "Pete!" His name came out in the midst of the whisper, and he froze, his heart sinking in his chest. The light of the flashlight flickered in his hand as he slowly turned in the direction the voice seemed to be coming from. There in the darkness, the figure reappeared. It stood closer than before, as if it had emerged from the night. This time Pete noticed the details. A long black cloak, a face hidden by a deep shadow, and a yellowish glow coming from its eyes. The figure stood still, but the darkness around it seemed to move as if it were alive. "What do you want?" Pete finally called out, feeling his voice breaking. But there was no answer, only a whisper that grew louder, mixing many voices into an ominous chorus. Unable to stand it, he rushed back into the cab and slammed the door, trying to block out the nightmare. His hands shook as he tried to start the truck again and again. Then suddenly the engine came to life. The headlights came on, illuminating the road in front of him, but at that moment he regretted turning them on. The figure stood directly in front of the truck, just a few meters away. Its face was still hidden, but its hands were now raised, as if it were gesturing for him to stop. Pete didn't wait. He stepped on the gas, trying to get past her. But when the truck was about to hit her, the figure vanished into thin air, leaving behind only a whisper that could be heard even over the roar of the engine. He continued to drive without stopping, but the road in front of him seemed the same. He seemed to be moving in a circle, and in the rearview mirror, the figure reappeared, now standing in the center of the road, much closer again. "This can't be true," he whispered, feeling reality begin to blur. The road ahead was an endless, narrow stretch of asphalt, but Pete no longer believed it led anywhere. Each time he drove on, the landscape remained the same. Sand dunes, dead desert, and a darkness that seemed almost physical. The black-clad figure he had left behind now reappeared in the rearview mirror. It was walking straight down the center of the road, its yellow eyes glowing as they pierced the darkness. Pete stopped the truck, realizing that running away was pointless. He breathed heavily, trying to gather his thoughts. If this road, and perhaps the figure itself, was taunting him, he needed to find a way to stop them. Pete looked around, hoping to find something in the cab that might help. His eyes fell on the metal crowbar he always carried with him. Taking the crowbar, he opened the door and stepped out onto the road. His boots squeaked loudly on the asphalt, the sound seeming to be the only thing that broke the absolute silence. The figure stopped a few tens of meters away, its outline now looking clearer, almost human, but still too fuzzy to be real. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" shouted Pete, his voice falling on deaf ears. The whispering in response intensified, filling the air around him again. "You've come to the wrong place," a soft, almost indistinct voice said, but Pete couldn't tell if it was real or his own imagination. The figure stepped forward again, its face still hidden in deep shadow, but its yellow eyes glowing even more intensely. The darkness itself seemed to move around it, forming long shadows that stretched toward Pete. "That's enough!" He picked up the crowbar and took a step forward, forcing himself to overcome his fear. But his legs felt heavy, as if the ground beneath them were pulling him down. The darkness around him became almost impenetrable, except for the light of the flashlight, which now dimly illuminated the figure. Pete swung the crowbar and rushed toward it, but as soon as he was within striking distance, the figure vanished into thin air. At the same moment, a roar appeared around him as if thousands of voices were screaming at the same time. He dropped to his knees, covering his ears, but the screams pierced through. Then he noticed a sign on the edge of the road, where the dunes had almost completely swallowed up the asphalt, stood a stone monument with symbols carved into it. Its surface was smooth, but it was covered with strange patterns that glowed with a pale blue light. Pete didn't understand what it was, but something in him told him it was important. He got up, staggering, and walked toward the monument, hoping to find the answer there. As soon as he touched its surface, the whispering stopped. The figure in black appeared before him again, but now its face was open. It was not human. Its skin resembled ash. Its eyes glowed with cold yellow fire, and its mouth, full of sharp teeth, was stretched in a sinister smile. "Do you think you can leave this place?" she said, her voice both soft and loud, as if echoing from every corner of the desert. Pete felt a chill fill his body, but he summoned all his will and lifted the crowbar, pointing it directly at the monument. "If this is a trap, I'm going to destroy it." He hit the stone with all his might. The symbols glowed with a bright light that flooded everything around, and the light began to absorb the shadow. The figure disappeared, the whispering stopped, and Pete fell to his knees, exhausted but feeling his fear begin to ease. The light that burst from the stone melted the darkness, as if dispersing a thick fog. Pete was lying on the asphalt, breathing heavily, the crowbar falling from his hand. Everything around him plunged into silence again, but this time it was different, not as oppressive as before. The stars above the desert shone brighter, and the cold air seemed incredibly fresh. He stood up looking around. The stone monument he had just smashed was destroyed, and there was no trace of the glow. The figure in black was gone, too, along with its eerie yellow eyes. For a moment, Pete thought it was over. He returned to the truck, climbed into the cab, and turned on the engine. To his surprise, the truck started right up. The headlights illuminated the road, which now looked normal. No abandoned cars, no shadows. Pete drove forward, gently stepping on the gas, afraid that everything might come back. But with every mile, he felt relieved. The road became straight, and the desert no longer seemed so hostile. Even the radio came to life, transmitting faint signals from familiar stations. A few hours passed, and the lights of a small town appeared on the horizon. Pete breathed a sigh of relief, not believing he had made it. He stopped at the first gas station, got out of the truck, and looked up at the sky. It was clear, without a hint of the ominous darkness that shrouded the dead mile. Maybe I'm just tired, he thought, wiping the sweat from his brow. But when he returned to the cab, his heart sank. On the windshield, as if drawn with something sticky, the words appeared. "This is not over." Pete looked around, but the gas station was empty. Only a faint wind played with the sand. He got back behind the wheel, trying to convince himself that it was just a prank or the result of his overexertion. As he started back down the road, something in the rearview mirror made his stomach clench. Far behind him, among the dunes, he saw a tall figure. It stood motionless, its yellow eyes glowing in the darkness, watching him. Pete looked sharply ahead, refusing to look back. But now he knew the road would not let go, and perhaps it would never let go.